A Passage to India, by E.M. Forster. Part 3, Temple. Chapter 33. Some hundreds of miles westward of the Marabai Hills, and 2 years later in time, Professor Narang Godbole stands in the presence of God. God is not born yet, that will occur at midnight, but he has also been born centuries ago, nor can he ever be born, because he is the Lord of the universe, who transcends human processes. He is not, was. He and Professor Godbole stood at opposite ends of the same strip of carpet. Tukaram, thou art my father and mother and everybody. This corridor in the palace at Moor opened through other corridors into a courtyard. It was of beautiful hard white stucco, but its pillars and vaulting could scarcely be seen behind coloured rags, iridescent balls, chandeliers of opaque pink glass, and murky photographs framed crookedly. At the end was the small but famous shrine of the dynastic cult, and the god to be born was largely a silver image the size of a teaspoon. Hindus sat on either side of the carpet where they could find room, or overflowed into the adjoining corridors and the courtyard. Hindus only, mild-featured men, mostly villagers, for whom anything outside their villages passed in a dream. They were the toiling yachts, whom some call the real India. Mixed with them sat a few tradesmen out of the little town, officials, courtiers, scions of the ruling house, schoolboys kept in efficient order. The assembly was in a tender, happy state unknown to an English crowd. It seethed like a beneficent potion. When the villagers broke cordon for a glimpse of the silver image, a most beautiful and radiant expression came into their faces, a beauty in which there was nothing personal, for it caused them all to resemble one another during the moment of its indwelling, and only when it was withdrawn did they revert to individual clods. And so with the music. Music there was, but from so many sources that the sum total was unterambled. The braying, banging, crooning melted into a single mass which trailed round the palace before joining the thunder. Rain fell at intervals throughout the night. It was the turn of Professor Godbole's choir. As Minister of Education, he gained this special honor. When the previous group of singers dispersed into the crowd, he pressed forward from the back, already in full voice, that the chain of sacred sounds might be uninterrupted. He was barefoot and in white. He wore a pale blue turban. His gold pince-nez had caught in a jasmine garland, and lay sideways down his nose. He and the 6 colleagues who supported him clashed their cymbals, hit small drums, droned upon a portable harmonium, and sang, Tukaram, thou art my father and mother and everybody. They sang not even to the God who confronted them, but to a saint. They did not one thing which the non-Hindu would feel dramatically correct. This approaching triumph of India was a muddle, as we call it, a frustration of reason and form. Where was the God himself, in whose honor the congregation had gathered? Indistinguishable in the jumble of his own altar, huddled out of sight amid images of inferior descent, smothered under rose leaves, overhung by oleographs, outblazed by golden tablets representing the Raja's ancestors, and entirely obscured, when the wind blew, by the tattered foliage of a banana. Hundreds of electric lights had been lit in his honor, worked by an engine whose thumps destroyed the rhythm of the hymn. Yet his face could not be seen. Hundreds of his silver dishes were piled around him with the minimum of effect. The inscriptions which the poets of the state had composed were hung where they could not be read, or had twitched their drawing pins out of the stucco, and one of them, composed in English to indicate his universality, consisted, by an unfortunate slip of the draftsman, of the words, God see love. God see love. Is this the first message of India, Tukaram? Continued the choir, reinforced by a squabble behind the veiled curtain, where two mothers tried to push their children at the same moment to the front. A little girl's leg shot out like an eel. In the courtyard, drenched by the rain, the small Europeanized band stumbled off into a waltz. Nights of gladness they were playing. The singers were not perturbed by this rival. They lived beyond competition. It was long before the tiny fragment of Professor Godbowl that attended to outside things decided that his pince-nez was in trouble, and that until it was adjusted he could not choose a new hymn. He laid down one cymbal, with the other he clashed the air. With his free hand he fumbled at the flowers round his neck. A colleague assisted him, singing into one another's grey moustaches. They disentangled the chain from the tinsel into which it had sunk. Godbowl consulted the music book, said a word to the drummer, who broke rhythm, made a thick little blur of sound, and produced a new rhythm. This was more exciting, the inner images it evoked more definite, and the singers' expressions became fatuous and languid. They loved all men, the whole universe, and scraps of their past, tiny splinters of detail, emerged for a moment to melt into the universal warmth. Thus Godbowl, though she was not important to him, remembered an old woman he had met in Chandrapur days. Chance brought her into his mind while it was in this heated state. He did not select her. She happened to occur among the throng of soliciting images, a tiny splinter, and he impelled her by his spiritual force to that place where completeness can be found. Completeness, not reconstruction. His senses grew thinner. He remembered a wasp seen he forgot where, perhaps on a stone. He loved the wasp equally, he impelled it likewise. He was imitating God. And the stone where the wasp clung, could he know? He could not. He had been wrong to attempt the stone. Logic and conscious effort had seduced. He came back to the strip of red carpet and discovered that he was dancing upon it, up and down, a third of the way to the altar and back again, clashing his cymbals, his little legs twinkling, his companions dancing with him and each other. Noise, noise, the Europeanized band louder, incense on the altar, sweat, the blaze of lights, wind in the bananas, noise, thunder, 11:50 by his wristwatch, seen as he threw up his hands and detached the tiny reverberation that was his soul. Louder shouts in the crowd. He danced on. The boys and men who were squatting in the aisles were lifted forcibly and dropped without changing their shapes into the laps of their neighbors. Down the path thus cleared advanced a litter. It was the aged ruler of the state, brought against the advice of his physicians to witness the birth ceremony. No one greeted the Raja, nor did he wish it. This was no moment for human glory, nor could a litter be set down, lest it defile the temple by becoming a throne. He was lifted out of it while its feet remained in air, and deposited on the carpet close to the altar. His immense beard was straightened, his legs tucked under him, a paper containing red powder was placed in his hand. There he sat, leaning against a pillar, exhausted with illness, his eyes magnified by many unshed tears. He had not to wait long. In a land where all else was unpunctual, the hour of the birth was chronometrically observed. 3 minutes before it was due, a Brahmin brought forth a model of the village of Gokul, the Bethlehem in that nebulous story, and placed it in front of the altar. The model was on a wooden tray about a yard square. It was of clay, and was gaily blue and white with streamers and paint. Here, upon a chair too small for him and with a head too large, sat King Kansa, who is Herod, directing the murder of some innocents, and in a corner, similarly proportioned, stood the father and mother of the Lord, warned to depart in a dream. The model was not holy, but more than a decoration, for it diverted men from the actual image of the god, and increased their sacred bewilderment. Some of the villagers thought the birth had occurred, saying with truth that the Lord must have been born, or they could not see him. But the clock struck midnight, and simultaneously the rending note of the conch broke forth, followed by the trumpeting of elephants. All who had packets of powder threw them at the altar, and in the rosy dust and incense, and clanging and shouts, infinite love took upon itself the form of Sri Krishna, and saved the world. All sorrow was annihilated, not only for Indians, but for foreigners, birds, caves, railways, and the stars. All became joy, all laughter. There had never been disease nor doubt, misunderstanding, cruelty, fear. Some jumped in the air, others flung themselves prone and embraced the bare feet of the universal lover. The women behind the veil slapped and shrieked. The little girl slipped out and danced by herself, her black pigtails flying. Not an orgy of the body. The tradition of that shrine forbade it. But the human spirit had tried by a desperate contortion to ravish the unknown, flinging down science and history in the struggle. Yes, beauty herself. Did it succeed? Books written afterwards say yes. But how, if there is such an event, can it be remembered afterwards? How can it be expressed in anything but itself? Not only from the unbeliever are mysteries hid, but the adept himself cannot retain them. He may think, if he chooses, that he has been with God, but as soon as he thinks it, it becomes history, and falls under the rules of time. A cobra of papier mâché now appeared on the carpet, also a wooden cradle swinging from a frame. Professor Godbowl approached the latter with a red silk napkin in his arms. The napkin was God, not that it was, and the image remained in the blur of the altar. It was just a napkin, folded into a shape which indicated a baby's. The professor dandled it and gave it to the Raja, who, making a great effort, said, "I name this child Sri Krishna," and tumbled it into the cradle. Tears poured from his eyes, because he had seen the Lord's salvation. He was too weak to exhibit the silk baby to his people, his privilege in former years. His attendants lifted him up, a new path was cleared through the crowd, and he was carried away to a less sacred part of the palace. There, in a room accessible to Western science by an outer staircase, his physician, Dr. Aziz, awaited him. His Hindu physician, who had accompanied him to the shrine, briefly reported his symptoms. As the ecstasy receded, the invalid grew fretful. The bumping of the steam engine that worked the dynamo disturbed him, and he asked for what reason it had been introduced into his home. They replied that they would inquire, and administered a sedative. Down in the sacred corridors, joy had seethed to jollity. It was their duty to play various games to amuse the newly born god, and to simulate his sports with the wanton dairymaids of Brindaban. Butter played a prominent part in these. When the cradle had been removed, the principal nobles of the state gathered together for an innocent frolic. They removed their turbans, and one put a lump of butter on his forehead, and waited for it to slide down his nose into his mouth. Before it could arrive, another stole up behind him, snatched the melting morsel, and swallowed it himself. All laughed exultantly at discovering that the divine sense of humor coincided with their own. God see love. There is fun in heaven. God can play practical jokes upon himself, draw chairs away from beneath his own posteriors, set his own turbans on fire, and steal his own petticoats when he bathes. By sacrificing good taste, this worship achieved what Christianity has shirked. the inclusion of merriment. All spirit as well as all matter must participate in salvation, and if practical jokes are banned, the circle is incomplete. Having swallowed the butter, they played another game which chanced to be graceful, the fondling of Sri Krishna under the similitude of a child. A pretty red and gold ball is thrown, and he who catches it chooses a child from the crowd, raises it in his arms, and carries it round to be caressed. All stroke the darling creature for the Creator's sake, and murmur happy words. The child is restored to his parents, the ball thrown on, and another child becomes for a moment the world's desire. And the Lord bounds hither and thither through the aisles, chance, and the sport of chance, irradiating little mortals with his immortality. When they had played this long enough, and being exempt from boredom, they played it again and again. They took many sticks and hit them together, whack smack, as though they fought the Pandava wars, and threshed and churned with them. And later on they hung from the roof of the temple, in a net, a great black earthenware jar, which was painted here and there with red, and wreathed with dried figs. Now came a rousing sport. Springing up, they struck at the jar with their sticks. It cracked, broke, and a mass of greasy rice and milk poured onto their faces. They ate and smeared one another's mouths, and dived between each other's legs for what had been pashed upon the carpet. This way and that spread the divine mess, until the line of schoolboys, who had somewhat fended off the crowd, broke for their share. The corridors, the courtyard, were filled with benign confusion. Also the flies awoke and claimed their share of God's bounty. There was no quarreling, owing to the nature of the gift, for blessed is the man who confers it on another. He imitates God. And those imitations, those substitutions, continued to flicker through the assembly for many hours, awaking in each man, according to his capacity, an emotion that he would not have had otherwise. No definite image survived. At the birth it was questionable whether a silver doll or a mud village, or a silk napkin, or an intangible spirit, or a pious resolution, had been born. Perhaps all these things, perhaps none. Perhaps all birth is an allegory. Still, it was the main event of the religious year. It caused strange thoughts. Covered with grease and dust, Professor Godboll had once more developed the life of his spirit. He had, with increasing vividness, again seen Mrs. Moore, and round her faintly clinging forms of trouble. He was a Brahmin, she Christian, but it made no difference. It made no difference whether she was a trick of his memory or a telepathic appeal. It was his duty, as it was his desire, to place himself in the position of the god and to love her, and to place himself in her position and to say to the god, "Come." This was all he could do. How inadequate! But each according to his own capacities, and he knew that his own were small. One old English woman and one little wasp, he thought, as he stepped out of the temple into the grey of a pouring wet morning. It does not seem much, still it is more than I am myself. Chapter 34. Dr. Aziz left the palace at the same time. As he returned to his house, which stood in a pleasant garden further up the main street of the town, he could see his old patron paddling and capering in the slush ahead. "Hello," he called, and it was the wrong remark, for the devotee indicated by circular gestures of his arms that he did not desire to be disturbed. He added, "Sorry," which was right, for Godboll twisted his head till it didn't belong to his body, and said in a strained voice that had no connection with his mind, "He arrived at the European guest house perhaps, at least possibly." Did he? Since when? But time was too definite. He waved his arm more dimly and disappeared. Aziz knew who he was. Fielding, but he refused to think about him, because it disturbed his life, and he still trusted the floods to prevent him from arriving. A fine little river issued from his garden gate and gave him much hope. It was impossible that anyone could get across from Dera in such weather as this. Fielding's visit was official. He had been transferred from Chandrapur, and sent on a tour through central India to see what the remoter states were doing with regard to English education. He had married, he had done the expected with Miss Quested, and Aziz had no wish to see him again. Dear old Godbowl, he thought, and smiled. He had no religious curiosity, and had never discovered the meaning of this annual antic, but he was well assured that Godbowl was a dear old man. He had come to more through him and remained on his account. Without him he could never have grasped problems so totally different from those of Chandrapur. For here the cleavage was between Brahman and non-Brahman. Muslims and English were quite out of the running, and sometimes not mentioned for days. Since Godbowl was a Brahman, Aziz was one also for purposes of intrigue. They would often joke about it together. The fissures in the Indian soil are infinite. Hinduism, so solid from a distance, is riven into sects and clans, which radiate and join, and change their names according to the aspect from which they are approached. Study it for years with the best teachers, and when you raise your head, nothing they have told you quite fits. Aziz, the day of his inauguration, had remarked, "I study nothing, I respect making an excellent impression." There was now a minimum of prejudice against him. Nominally under a Hindu doctor, he was really chief medicine man to the court. He had to drop inoculation and such Western whims, but even at Chandrapur his profession had been a game, centering round the operating table, and here in the backwoods he let his instruments rust, ran his little hospital at half steam, and caused no undue alarm. His impulse to escape from the English was sound. They had frightened him permanently, and there are only two reactions against fright: to kick and scream on committees, or to retreat to a remote jungle, where the Sahib seldom comes. His old lawyer friends wanted him to stop in British India and help agitate, and might have prevailed, but for the treachery of Fielding. The news had not surprised him in the least. A rift had opened between them after the trial when Cyril had not joined in his procession. Those advocacies of the girl had increased it. Then came the postcards from Venice, so cold, so unfriendly that all agreed that something was wrong, and finally, after a silence, the expected letter from Hampstead. Mahmoud Ali was with him at the time. "Some news that will surprise you. I am to marry someone whom you know." He did not read further. "Here it comes, answer for me," and he threw it to Mahmoud Ali. Subsequent letters he destroyed unopened. It was the end of a foolish experiment, and though sometimes at the back of his mind he felt that Fielding had made sacrifices for him, it was now all confused with his genuine hatred of the English. "I am an Indian at last," he thought, standing motionless in the rain. Life passed pleasantly. The climate was healthy so that the children could be with him all the year round, and he had married again, not exactly a marriage, but he liked to regard it as one, and he read his Persian, wrote his poetry, had his horse, and sometimes got some shikar while the good Hindus looked the other way. His poems were all on one cap: Oriental womanhood. The veiled must go, was their burden, otherwise we shall never be free. And he declared, fantastically, that India would not have been conquered if women as well as men had fought at Plassey. But we do not show our women to the foreigner, not explaining how this was to be managed, for he was writing a poem. Bulbuls and roses would still persist. The pathos of defeated Islam remained in his blood and could not be expelled by modernities, illogical poems, like their writer. Yet they struck a true note. There cannot be a motherland without new homes. In one poem, the only one funny old Godbowl liked, he had skipped over the motherland, whom he did not truly love, and gone straight to internationality. Ah, that is Bhakti. Ah, my young friend, that is different and very good. Ah, India, who seems not to move, will go straight there while the other nations waste their time. May I translate this particular one into Hindi? In fact, it might be rendered into Sanskrit almost, it is so enlightened. Yes, of course, all your other poems are very good too. His Highness was saying to Colonel Maggs last time he came that we are proud of you, simpering slightly. Colonel Maggs was the political agent for the neighborhood and Aziz's dejected opponent. The Criminal Investigation Department kept an eye on Aziz ever since the trial. They had nothing actionable against him, but Indians who have been unfortunate must be watched, and to the end of his life he remained under observation. Thanks to Miss Quested's mistake, Colonel Maggs learnt with concern that a suspect was coming to more, and, adopting a playful manner, rallied the old Raja for permitting a Muslim doctor to approach his sacred person. A few years ago, the Raja would have taken the hint, for the political agent then had been a formidable figure, descending with all the thunders of empire when it was most inconvenient, turning the polity inside out, requiring motor cars and tiger hunts, trees cut down that impeded the view from the guest house, cows milked in his presence, and generally arrogating the control of internal affairs. But there had been a change of policy in high quarters. Local thunders were no longer endorsed, and the group of little states that composed the agency discovered this and began comparing notes with fruitful result. To see how much, or how little, Colonel Maggs would stand, became an agreeable game at more, which was played by all the departments of state. He had to stand the appointment of Dr. Aziz. The Raja did not take the hint, but replied that Hindus were less exclusive than formerly, thanks to the enlightened commands of the Viceroy, and he felt it his duty to move with the times. Yes, all had gone well hitherto, but now, when the rest of the state was plunged in its festival, he had a crisis of a very different sort. A note awaited him at his house. There was no doubt that Fielding had arrived overnight, nor much doubt that Godbowl knew of his arrival, for the note was addressed to him, and he had read it before sending it on to Aziz, and had written in the margin, "Is not this delightful news? But unfortunately my religious duties prevent me from taking any action." Fielding announced that he had inspected Mudcal, Miss Derrick's former preserve, that he had nearly been drowned at Deira, that he had reached more according to timetable, and hoped to remain the 2 days, studying the various educational innovations of his old friend. Nor had he come alone. His wife and her brother accompanied him. And then the note turned into the sort of note that always did arrive from the state guest house, wanting something. No eggs. Mosquito nets torn. When would they pay their respects to His Highness? Was it correct that a torchlight procession would take place? If so, might they view it? They didn't want to give trouble, but if they might stand in a balcony, or if they might go out in a boat. Aziz tore the note up. He had enough of showing Miss Quested's native life. Treacherous, hideous harridan, bad people altogether. He hoped to avoid them, though this might be difficult, for they would certainly be held up for several days at more. Down country, the floods were even worse, and the pale grey faces of lakes had appeared in the direction of the Asiga railway station. Chapter 35. Long before he discovered Moor, another young Mohammedan had retired there, a saint. His mother said to him, "Free prisoners." So he took a sword and went up to the fort. He unlocked a door, and the prisoners streamed out and resumed their previous occupations. But the police were too much annoyed and cut off the young man's head. Ignoring its absence, he made his way over the rocks that separate the fort and the town, killing policemen as he went, and he fell outside his mother's house, having accomplished her orders. Consequently, there are two shrines to him today, that of the head above, and that of the body below, and they are worshipped by the few Mohammedans who live near, and by Hindus also. There is no God but God. That symmetrical injunction melts in the mild airs of Moor. It belongs to pilgrimages and universities, not to feudalism and agriculture. When Aziz arrived, and found that even Islam was idolatrous, he grew scornful, and longed to purify the place, like Al-Amgr. But soon he didn't mind, like Akbar. After all, this saint had freed prisoners, and he himself had lain in prison. The shrine of the body lay in his own garden and produced a weekly crop of lamps and flowers, and when he saw them he recalled his sufferings. The shrine of the head made a nice short walk for the children. He was off duty the morning after the great puja, and he told them to come. Jemila held his hand. Ahmed and Karim ran in front, arguing what the body looked like as it came staggering down, and whether they would have been frightened if they met it. He didn't want them to grow up superstitious, so he rebuked them, and they answered yes, father, for they were well brought up, but, like himself, they were impervious to argument, and after a polite pause they continued saying what their natures compelled them to say. A slim, tall eight-sided building stood at the top of the slope, among some bushes. This was the shrine of the head. It had not been roofed, and was indeed merely a screen. Inside it crouched a humble dome, and inside that, visible through a grille, was a truncated gravestone, swathed in calico. The inner angles of the screen were cumbered with bees' nests, and a gentle shower of broken wings and other aerial oddments kept falling, and had strewn the damp pavement with their flew. Ahmed, apprised by Muhammad Latif of the character of the bee, said, "They will not hurt us, whose lives are chaste," and pushed boldly in. His sister was more cautious. From the shrine they went to a mosque, which, in size and design, resembled a fire screen. The arcades of Chandrapur had shrunk to a flat piece of ornamental stucco, with protuberances at either end to suggest minarets. The funny little thing didn't even stand straight, for the rock on which it had been put was slipping down the hill. It, and the shrine, were a strange outcome of the protests of Arabia. They wandered over the old fort, now deserted, and admired the various views. The scenery, according to their standards, was delightful, the sky grey and black, bellyfuls of rain all over it, the earth pocked with pools of water and slimy with mud. A magnificent monsoon, the best for 3 years, the tanks already full, bumper crops possible. Out towards the river, the route by which the Fieldings had escaped from Dira, the downpour had been enormous. The mails had to be pulled across by ropes. They could just see the break in the forest trees where the gorge came through, and the rocks above that marked the site of the diamond mine, glistening with wet. Close beneath was the suburban residence of the Juno Rani, isolated by floods, and Her Highness, lax about veiled, to be seen paddling with her handmaidens in the garden and waving her sari at the monkeys on the roof. But better not look close beneath. Perhaps, nor towards the European guest house either. Beyond the guest house rose another grey-green gloom of hills, covered with temples like little white flames. There were over 200 gods in that direction alone, who visited each other constantly, and owned numerous cows, and all the betel leaf industry. Besides having shares in the Asiga motor omnibus, many of them were in the palace at this moment, having the time of their lives. Others, too large or proud to travel, had sent symbols to represent them. The air was thick with religion and rain. Their white shirts fluttering, Ahmed and Karim ran about over the fort, shrieking with joy. Presently they intersected a line of prisoners, who were looking aimlessly at an old bronze gun. "Which of you is to be pardoned?" they asked, for tonight was the procession of the chief god, when he would leave the palace, escorted by the whole power of the state, and pass by the jail, which stood down in the town now. As he did so, troubling the waters of our civilization, one prisoner would be released, and then he would proceed to the great moor-tank that stretched as far as the guest-house garden, where something else would happen, some final or subsidiary apotheosis, after which he would submit to the experience of sleep. The Aziz family did not grasp as much as this, being Muslim, but the visit to the jail was common knowledge. Smiling, with downcast eyes, the prisoners discussed with the gentry their chances of salvation. Except for the irons on their legs, they resembled other men, nor did they feel different. 5 of them, who had not yet been brought to trial, could expect no pardon, but all who had been convicted were full of hope. They did not distinguish between the god and the Raja in their minds. Both were too far above them, but the guard was better educated, and ventured to inquire after His Highness's health. "It always improves," replied the medicine man. As a matter of fact, the Raja was dead. The ceremony overnight had overtaxed his strength. His death was being concealed lest the glory of the festival were dimmed. The Hindu physician, the private secretary, and a confidential servant remained with the corpse, while Aziz had assumed the duty of being seen in public, and misleading people. He had liked the ruler very much, and might not prosper under his successor, yet he could not worry over such problems yet, for he was involved in the illusion he helped to create. The children continued to run about, hunting for a frog to put in Muhammad Latif's bed. The little fools. Hundreds of frogs lived in their own garden, but they must needs catch one up on the fort. They reported 2 caps below. Fielding and his brother-in-law, instead of resting after their journey, were climbing the slope to the saint's tomb. "Throw stones?" asked Karim. "Put powdered glass in their pan?" "Ahmed, come here for such wickedness." He raised his hand to smite his firstborn, but allowed it to be kissed instead. It was sweet to have his sons with him at this moment, and to know they were affectionate and brave. He pointed out that the Englishmen were state guests, so must not be poisoned, and received, as always, gentle yet enthusiastic assent to his words. The 2 visitors entered the octagon, but rushed out at once pursued by some bees. Hither and thither they ran, beating their heads. The children shrieked with derision, and out of heaven, as if a plug had been pulled, fell a jolly dollop of rain. Aziz had not meant to greet his former friend, but the incident put him into an excellent temper. He felt compact and strong. He shouted out, "Hello, gentlemen, are you in trouble?" The brother-in-law exclaimed, "A bee had got him." "Lie down in a pool of water, my dear sir, here are plenty." "Don't come near me. I cannot control them, they are state bees." Complain to His Highness of their behavior. There was no real danger, for the rain was increasing. The swarm retired to the shrine. He went up to the stranger and pulled a couple of stings out of his wrist, remarking, "Come, pull yourself together and be a man." "How do you do, Aziz? After all this time, I heard you were settled in here," Fielding called to him, but not in friendly tones. "I suppose a couple of stings don't signify." "Not the least. I'll send an embrocation over to the guest house. I heard you were settled in there. Why have you not answered my letters?" he asked, going straight for the point, but not reaching it, owing to buckets of rain. His companion, new to the country, cried, as the drops drummed on his cap, that the bees were renewing their attack. Fielding checked his antics rather sharply, then said, "Is there a short cut down to our carriage?" "We must give up our walk. The weather's pestilential." "Yes, that way." "Are you not coming down yourself?" Aziz sketched a comic salaam. Like all Indians, he was skillful in the slighter impertinences. "I tremble, I obey," the gesture said, and it was not lost upon Fielding. They walked down a rough path to the road, the two men first, the brother-in-law, boy rather than man, next, in a state over his arm, which hurt, the three Indian children last, noisy and impudent, all six wet through. "How goes it, Aziz?" "In my usual health." "Are you making anything out of your life here? How much do you make out of yours?" "Who is in charge of the guest house?" he asked, giving up his slight effort to recapture their intimacy, and growing more official. He was older and sterner. "His Highness's private secretary, probably." "Where is he, then?" "I don't know. Because not a soul's been near us since we arrived." "Really?" "I wrote beforehand to the Dubar, and asked if a visit was convenient. I was told it was, and arranged my tour accordingly, but the guest house servants appear to have no definite instructions. We can't get any eggs, also my wife wants to go out in the boat." "There are two boats." "Exactly, and no oars. Colonel Maggs broke the oars when he last." "All four?" "He is a most powerful man. If the weather lifts, we want to see your torchlight procession from the water this evening," he pursued. "I wrote to Godbowl about it, but he has taken no notice. It's a place of the dead. Perhaps your letter never reached the minister in question. Will there be any objection to English people watching the procession? I know nothing at all about the religion here. I should never think of watching it myself. We had a very different reception both at Mudcull and Deira. They were kindness itself at Deira. The Maharaja and Maharani wanted us to see everything. You should never have left them. Jump in, Ralph." They had reached the carriage. "Jump in, Mr. Quested, and Mr. Fielding." "Who on earth is Mr. Quested? Do I mispronounce that well-known name? Is he not your wife's brother? Who on earth do you suppose I've married?" "I'm only Ralph Moore," said the boy, blushing, and at that moment there fell another pailful of the rain, and made a mist round their feet. Aziz tried to withdraw, but it was too late. "Quested? Don't you know that my wife was Mrs. Moore's daughter?" He trembled, and went purplish-grey. He hated the news, hated hearing the name Moore. "Perhaps this explains your odd attitude?" "And pray what is wrong with my attitude?" "The preposterous letter you allowed Mahmoud Ali to write for you. This is a very useless conversation, I consider." "However did you make such a mistake?" said Fielding, more friendly than before, but scathing and scornful. "It's almost unbelievable. I should think I wrote you half a dozen times, mentioning my wife by name." "Miss Quested. What an extraordinary notion." From his smile, Aziz guessed that Stella was beautiful. Miss Quested is our best friend, she introduced us. But what an amazing notion, Aziz. We must thrash this misunderstanding out later on. It is clearly some devilry of Mahmoud Ali's. He knows perfectly well I married Ms. Moore. He called her his Lop's sister in his insolent letter to me. The name woke furies in him. So she is, and here is his Lop's brother, and you his brother-in-law, and goodbye. Shame turned into a rage that brought back his self-respect. What does it matter to me who you marry? Don't trouble me here at Moore is all I ask. I do not want you, I do not want one of you in my private life. With my dying breath I say it. Yes, yes, I made a foolish blunder. Despise me and feel cold. I thought you married my enemy. I never read your letter. Mahmoud Ali deceived me. I thought you'd stolen my money. But he clapped his hands together, and his children gathered round him. It's as if you stole it. I forgive Mahmoud Ali all things, because he loved me. Then pausing, while the rain exploded like pistols, he said, my heart is for my own people henceforward, and turned away. Cyril followed him through the mud, apologizing, laughing a little, wanting to argue and reconstruct, pointing out with irrefragable logic that he had married, not his Lop's betrothed, but his Lop's sister. What difference did it make at this hour of the day? He had built his life on a mistake. But he had built it. Speaking in Urdu, that the children might understand, he said, please do not follow us, whomever you marry. I wish no Englishman or Englishwoman to be my friend. He returned to the house excited and happy. It had been an uneasy, uncanny moment when Mrs. Moore's name was mentioned, stirring memories. As Mrs. Moore. As though she was coming to help him. She had always been so good, and that youth whom he had scarcely looked at was her son, Ralph Moore, Stella and Ralph, whom he had promised to be kind to, and Stella had married Cyril. Chapter 36. All the time the palace ceased not to thrum and tum-tum. The revelation was over, but its effect lasted. And its effect was to make men feel that the revelation had not yet come. Hope existed despite fulfillment, as it will be in heaven. Although the God had been born, his procession, loosely supposed by many to be the birth, had not taken place. In normal years, the middle hours of this day were signalized by performances of great beauty in the private apartments of the Rajah. He owned a consecrated troop of men and boys, whose duty it was to dance various actions and meditations of his faith before him. Seated at his ease, he could witness the 3 steps by which the Savior ascended the universe to the discomfiture of Indra, also the death of the dragon, the mountain that turned into an umbrella, and the saint who, with comic results, invoked the god before dining. All culminated in the dance of the milkmaidens before Krishna, and in the still greater dance of Krishna before the milkmaidens, when the music and the musicians swirled through the dark blue robes of the actors into their tinsel crowns, and all became one. The Rajah and his guests would then forget that this was a dramatic performance, and would worship the actors. Nothing of the sort could occur today, because death interrupts. It interrupted less here than in Europe. Its pathos was less poignant, its irony less cruel. There were 2 claimants to the throne, unfortunately, who were in the palace now and suspected what had happened. Yet they made no trouble, because religion is a living force to the Hindus, and can at certain moments fling down everything that is petty and temporary in their natures. The festival flowed on, wild and sincere, and all men loved each other, and avoided by instinct whatever could cause inconvenience or pain. Aziz could not understand this, any more than an average Christian could. He was puzzled that more should suddenly be purged from suspicion and self-seeking. Although he was an outsider, and excluded from their rites, they were always particularly charming to him at this time. He and his household received small courtesies and presents, just because he was outside. He had nothing to do all day, except to send the embrocation over to the guest house, and towards sunset he remembered it, and looked round his house for a local palliative, for the dispensary was shut. He found a tin of ointment belonging to Muhammad Latif, who was unwilling it should be removed, for magic words had been spoken over it while it was being boiled down. But Aziz promised that he would bring it back after application to the stings. He wanted an excuse for a ride. The procession was beginning to form as he passed the palace. A large crowd watched the loading of the state palanquin, the prow of which protruded in the form of a silver dragon's head through the lofty half-opened door. Gods, big and little, were getting aboard. He averted his eyes, for he never knew how much he was supposed to see, and nearly collided with the Minister of Education. "Ah, you might make me late," meaning that the touch of non-Hindu would necessitate another bath. The words were spoken without moral heat. "Sorry," said Aziz. The other smiled, and again mentioned the guest house party, and when he heard that Fielding's wife was not Miss Quested after all, remarked, "Ah, no, he married the sister of Mr. Heaslop." "Ah, exactly. I have known that for over a year, also without heat." "Why did you not tell me?" "Your silence plunged me into a pretty pickle." Godbowl, who had never been known to tell anyone anything, smiled again, and said in deprecating tones, "Never be angry with me. I am, as far as my limitations permit, your true friend. Besides, it is my holy festival." Aziz always felt like a baby in that strange presence, a baby who unexpectedly receives a toy. He smiled also, and turned his horse into a lane, for the crush increased. The sweepers' band was arriving, playing on sieves and other emblems of their profession. They marched straight at the gate of the palace with the air of a victorious army. All other music was silent, for this was ritually the moment of the despised and rejected. The god could not issue from his temple until the unclean sweepers played their tune. They were the spot of filth without which the spirit cannot cohere. For an instant the scene was magnificent. The doors were thrown open, and the whole court was seen inside, barefoot and dressed in white robes. In the fairway stood the Ark of the Lord, covered with cloth of gold and flanked by peacock fans and by stiff circular banners of crimson. It was full to the brim with statuettes and flowers. As it rose from the earth on the shoulders of its bearers, the friendly sun of the monsoons shone forth and flooded the world with color, so that the yellow tigers painted on the palace walls seemed to spring, and pink and green skeins of cloud to link up the upper sky. The palanquin moved. The lane was full of state elephants, who would follow it, their howdahs empty out of humility. Aziz did not pay attention to these sanctities, for they had no connection with his own. He felt bored, slightly cynical, like his own dear Emperor Babur, who came down from the north and found in Hindustan no good fruit, no fresh water or witty conversation, not even a friend. The lane led quickly out of the town onto high rocks and jungle. Here he drew rein and examined the great moor tank, which lay exposed beneath him to its remotest curve. Reflecting the evening clouds, it filled the netherworld with an equal splendor, so that earth and sky leant toward one another, about to clash in ecstasy. He spat, cynical again, more cynical than before, for in the center of the burnished circle a small black blot was advancing, the guest house boat. Those English had improvised something to take the place of oars, and were proceeding in their work of patrolling India. The sight endeared the Hindus by comparison, and looking back at the milk-white hump of the palace, he hoped that they would enjoy carrying their idol about, for at all events it did not pry into other people's lives. This pose of seeing India which had seduced him to Miss Quested at Chandrapur was only a form of ruling India. No sympathy lay behind it. He knew exactly what was going on in the boat as the party gazed at the steps down which the image would presently descend, and debated how near they might row without getting into trouble officially. He did not give up his ride, for there would be servants at the guest house whom he could question. A little information never comes amiss. He took the path by the sombre promontory that contained the royal tombs. Like the palace, they were of snowy stucco, and gleamed by their internal light, but their radiance grew ghostly under approaching night. The promontory was covered with lofty trees, and the fruit bats were unhooking from the boughs and making kissing sounds as they grazed the surface of the tank. Hanging upside down all the day, they had grown thirsty. The signs of the contented Indian evening multiplied. Frogs on all sides, cow dung burning eternally, a flock of belated hornbills overhead, looking like winged skeletons as they flapped across the gloaming. There was death in the air, but not sadness. A compromise had been made between destiny and desire, and even the heart of man acquiesced. The European guest house stood 200 feet above the water, on the crest of a rocky and wooded spur that jutted from the jungle. By the time Aziz arrived, the water had paled to a film of mauve grey, and the boat vanished entirely. A sentry slept in the guest house porch. Lamps burned in the cruciform of the deserted rooms. He went from one room to another, inquisitive and malicious. 2 letters lying on the piano rewarded him, and he pounced and read them promptly. He was not ashamed to do this. The sanctity of private correspondence has never been ratified by the East. Moreover, Mr. McBride had read all his letters in the past, and spread their contents. One letter, the more interesting of the two, was from Heaslop to Fielding. It threw light on the mentality of his former friend, and it hardened him further against him. Much of it was about Ralph Moore, who appeared to be almost an imbecile. Hand on my brother whenever suits you. I write to you because he is sure to make a bad bust. Then, I quite agree, life is too short to cherish grievances. Also, I am relieved you feel able to come into line with the oppressors of India to some extent. We need all the support we can get. I hope that next time Stella comes my way she will bring you with her, when I will make you as comfortable as a bachelor can. It's certainly time we met. My sister's marriage to you coming after my mother's death and my own difficulties did upset me, and I was unreasonable. It is about time we made it up properly, as you say. Let us leave it at faults on both sides. Glad about your son and heir. When next any of you write to Adela, do give her some sort of message from me, for I should like to make my peace with her too. You are lucky to be out of British India at the present moment. Incident after incident, all due to propaganda, but we can't lay our hands on the connecting thread. The longer one lives here, the more certain one gets that everything hangs together. My personal opinion is, it's the Jews. Thus far the red-nosed boy. Aziz was distracted for a moment by blurred sounds coming from over the water. The procession was underway. The second letter was from Miss Quested to Mrs. Fielding. It contained 1 or 2 interesting touches. The writer hoped that Ralph will enjoy his India more than I did mine, and appeared to have given her money for this purpose. My debt which I shall never repay in person. What debt did Miss Quested imagine she owed the country? He did not relish the phrase. Talk of Ralph's health. It was all Stella and Ralph, even Cyril and Ronnie, all so friendly and sensible, and written in a spirit he could not command. He envied the easy intercourse that is only possible in a nation whose women are free. These 5 people were making up their little difficulties, and closing their broken ranks against the alien. Even Hislop was coming in. Hence the strength of England, and in a spurt of temper he hit the piano, and since the notes had swollen and stuck together in groups of 3s, he produced a remarkable noise. "Oh, who is that?" said a nervous and respectful voice. He could not remember where he had heard its tones before. "Something moved in the twilight of an adjoining room," he replied. State doctor, ridden over to inquire, very little English, slipped the letters into his pocket, and to show that he had free entry to the guest house, struck the piano again. Ralph Moore came into the light. What a strange-looking youth. Tall, prematurely aged, the big blue eyes faded with anxiety, the hair impoverished and tousled. Not a type that is often exported imperially. The doctor in Aziz thought, born of too old a mother, the poet found him rather beautiful. "I was unable to call early owing to pressure of work. How are the celebrated bee stings?" he asked patronizingly. I was resting. They thought I had better. They throb rather." His timidity and evident newness had complicated effects on the malcontent. Speaking threateningly, he said, "Come here, please. Allow me to look." They were practically alone, and he could treat the patient as Calendar had treated Newton. "You said this morning, the best of doctors make mistakes. Come here, please, for the diagnosis under the lamp. I am pressed for time." "Alf, what is the matter, pray? Your hands are unkind." He started and glanced down at them. The extraordinary youth was right, and he put them behind his back before replying with outward anger, "What the devil have my hands to do with you?" This is a most strange remark. "I am a qualified doctor, who will not hurt you. I don't mind pain." "There is no pain." "No pain? Not really." "Excellent news," sneered Aziz. "But there is cruelty. I have brought you some salve, but how to put it on in your present nervous state becomes a problem," he continued, after a pause. "Please leave it with me." "Certainly not. It returns to my dispensary at once." He stretched forward, and the other retreated to the farther side of a table. "Now, do you want me to treat your stings, or do you prefer an English doctor?" "There is one at Asiga. Asiga is 40 miles away, and the ring dam broken." "Now you see how you are placed." "I think I had better see Mr. Fielding about you. This is really great nonsense, your present behavior." "They are out in a boat," he replied, glancing about him for support. Aziz feigned intense surprise. "They have not gone in the direction of Moore, I hope." On a night like this the people become most fanatical. And, as if to confirm him, there was a sob, as though the lips of a giant had parted. The procession was approaching the jail. "You should not treat us like this," he challenged. And this time Aziz was checked, for the voice, though frightened, was not weak. "Like what?" "Dr. Aziz, we have done you no harm." "Aha, you know my name, I see." "Yes, I am Aziz." "No, of course your great friend Miss Quested did me no harm at the Maraba." Drowning his last words, all the guns of the state went off. A rocket from the jail garden gave the signal. The prisoner had been released, and was kissing the feet of the singers. Rose leaves fall from the houses, sacred spices and cocoa nut are brought forth. It was the halfway moment. The god had extended his temple, and paused exultantly. Mixed and confused in their passage, the rumors of salvation entered the guest house. They were startled and moved on to the porch, drawn by the sudden illumination. The bronze gun up on the fort kept flashing. The town was a blur of light, in which the houses seemed dancing, and the palace waving little wings. The water below, the hills and sky above, were not involved as yet. There was still only a little light and song struggling among the shapeless lumps of the universe. The song became audible through much repetition. The choir was repeating and inverting the names of deities. They sang, and woke the sleeping sentry in the guest house. He leant upon his iron-tipped spear. "I must go back now, good night," said Aziz, and held out his hand, completely forgetting that they were not friends, and focusing his heart on something more distant than the caves, something beautiful. His hand was taken, and then he remembered how detestable he had been, and said gently, "Don't you think me unkind anymore?" "No. How can you tell, you strange fellow?" "Not difficult, the one thing I always know." "Can you always tell whether a stranger is your friend?" "Yes." "Then you are an Oriental." He unclasped as he spoke, with a little shudder. Those words, he had said them to Mrs. Moore in the mosque in the beginning of the cycle, from which, after so much suffering, he had got free. Never be friends with the English. Mosque, caves. And here he was starting again. He handed the magic ointment to him. "Take this, think of me when you use it. I shall never want it back. I must give you one little present, and it is all I have got. You are Mrs. Moore's son." "I am that," he murmured to himself, and a part of Aziz's mind that had been hidden seemed to move and force its way to the top. "But you are his Lop's brother also, and alas, the two nations cannot be friends." "I know." "Not yet." "Did your mother speak to you about me?" "Yes." And with a swerve of voice and body that Aziz did not follow, he added, "In her letters, in her letters. She loved you." "Yes, your mother was my best friend in all the world." He was silent, puzzled by his own great gratitude. What did this eternal goodness of Mrs. Moore amount to? To nothing, if brought to the test of thought. She had not borne witness in his favor, nor visited him in the prison, yet she had stolen to the depths of his heart, and he always adored her. "This is our monsoon, the best weather," he said, while the lights of the procession waved as though embroidered on an agitated curtain. "How I wish she could have seen them, our rains. Now is the time when all things are happy, young and old. They are happy out there with their savage noise, though we cannot follow them. The tanks are all full so they dance, and this is India. I wish you were not with officials, then I would show you my country. But I cannot. Perhaps I will just take you out on the water now, for one short half hour." Was the cycle beginning again? His heart was too full to draw back. He must slip out in the darkness, and do this one act of homage to Mrs. Moore's son. He knew where the oars were, hidden to deter the visitors from going out, and he brought the second pair, in case they met the other boat. The Fieldings had pushed themselves out with long poles, and might get into difficulties, for the wind was rising. Once on the water, he became easy. One kind action was with him always a channel for another, and soon the torrent of his hospitality gushed forth, and he began doing the honors of Moore and persuading himself that he understood the wild procession, which increased in lights and sounds as the complications of its ritual developed. There was little need to row, for the freshening gale blew them in the direction they desired. Thorns scratched the keel. They ran into an islet and startled some cranes. The strange temporary life of the August flood water bore them up and seemed as though it would last forever. The boat was a rudderless dinghy, huddled up in the stern, with the spare pair of oars in his arms. The guest asked no questions about details. There was presently a flash of lightning, followed by a second flash. Little red scratches on the ponderous sky. "Was that the Raja?" he asked. What do you mean?" "Row back." "But there's no Raja." "Nothing. Row back, you will see what I mean." Aziz found it hard work against the advancing wind. But he fixed his eyes on the pin of light that marked the guest house and backed a few strokes. There, floating in the darkness, was a king, who sat under a canopy, in shining royal robes. "I can't tell you what that is, I'm sure," he whispered. "His Highness is dead. I think we should go back at once." They were close to the promontory of the tombs, and had looked straight into the country of the Raja's father through an opening in the trees. That was the explanation. He had heard of the image, made to imitate life at enormous expense, but he had never chanced to see it before, though he frequently rode on the lake. There was only one spot from which it could be seen, and Ralph had directed him to it. Hastily he pulled away, feeling that his companion was not so much a visitor as a guide. He remarked, "Shall we go back now? There is still the procession." "I'd rather not go nearer. They have such strange customs, and might hurt you." "A little nearer." Aziz obeyed. He knew with his heart that this was Mrs. Moore's son, and indeed until his heart was involved he knew nothing. Then went the chant, then suddenly changed, and in the interstice he heard, almost certainly, the syllables of salvation that had sounded during his trial at Chandrapur. "Mr. Moore, don't tell anyone that the Raja is dead. It is a secret still. I am supposed not to say. We pretend he is alive until after the festival, to prevent unhappiness. Do you want to go still nearer?" "Yes." He tried to keep the boat out of the glare of the torches that began to star the other shore. Rockets kept going off, also the guns. Suddenly, closer than he had calculated, the palanquin of Krishna appeared from behind a ruined wall, and descended the carved and glistening water steps. On either side of it the singers tumbled, a woman prominent, a wild and beautiful young saint with flowers in her hair. She was praising God without attributes. Thus did she apprehend him. Others praised him without attributes, seeing him in this or that organ of the body or manifestation of the sky. Down they rushed to the foreshore and stood in the small waves, and a sacred meal was prepared, of which those who felt worthy partook. Old Godpole detected the boat, which was drifting in on the gale, and he waved his arms, whether in wrath or joy Aziz never discovered. Above stood the secular power of Moor, elephants, artillery, crowds, and high above them a wild tempest started, confined at first to the upper regions of the air. Gusts of wind mixed darkness and light, sheets of rain cut from the north, stopped, cut from the south, began rising from below, and across them struggled the singers, sounding every note but terror, and preparing to throw God away. God himself, not that God can be thrown, into the storm. Thus was he thrown year after year, and were others thrown, little images of Ganpati, baskets of tender corn, tiny tazias after Moharam, scapegoats, husks, emblems of passage, a passage not easy, not now, not here, not to be apprehended except when it is unattainable. The god to be thrown was an emblem of that. The village of Gokul reappeared upon its tray. It was the substitute for the silver image, which never left its haze of flowers. On behalf of another symbol, it was to perish. A servitor took it in his hands, and tore off the blue and white streamers. He was naked, broad-shouldered, thin-waisted, the Indian body again triumphant, and it was his hereditary office to close the gates of salvation. He entered the dark waters, pushing the village before him, until the clay dolls slipped off their chairs and began to gutter in the rain, and King Kanza was confounded with the father and mother of the Lord. Dark and solid, the little waves sipped, then a great wave washed, and then English voices cried, "Take care." The boats had collided with each other. The four outsiders flung out their arms and grappled, and, with oars and poles sticking out, revolved like a mythical monster in the whirlwind. The worshippers howled with wrath or joy, as they drifted forward helplessly against the servitor, who awaited them, his beautiful dark face expressionless, and as the last morsels melted on his tray, it struck them. The shock was minute, but Stella, nearest to it, shrank into her husband's arms, then reached forward, then flung herself against Aziz, and her motions capsized them. They plunged into the warm, shallow water, and rose struggling into a tornado of noise. The oars, the sacred tray, the letters of Ronnie and Adila, broke loose and floated confusedly. Artillery was fired, drums beaten, the elephants trumpeted, and drowning all an immense peal of thunder, unaccompanied by lightning, cracked like a mallet on the dome. That was the climax, as far as India admits of one. The rain settled in steadily to its job of wetting everybody and everything through, and soon spoiled the cloth of gold on the palanquin and the costly disc-shaped banners. Some of the torches went out, fireworks didn't catch, there began to be less singing, and the tray returned to Professor Godbowl, who picked up a fragment of the mud adhering and smeared it on his forehead without much ceremony. Whatever had happened, and while the intruders picked themselves up, the crowds of Hindus began a desultory move back into the town. The image went back too, and on the following day underwent a private death of its own, when some curtains of magenta and green were lowered in front of the dynastic shrine. The singing went on, even longer, ragged edges of religion, unsatisfactory and undramatic tangles. God is love. Looking back at the great blur of the last 24 hours, no man could say where was the emotional center of it, any more than he could locate the heart of a cloud. Last chapter. Friends again, yet aware that they could meet no more, Aziz and Fielding went for their last ride in the Moor jungles. The floods had abated and the Raja was officially dead, so the guest house party were departing next morning, as decorum required. What with the morning and the festival, the visit was a failure. Fielding had scarcely seen Godbowl, who promised every day to show him over the King Emperor George V High School, his main objective, but always made some excuse. This afternoon Aziz let out what had happened. The King Emperor had been converted into a granary, and the Minister of Education did not like to admit this to his former principal. The school had been opened only last year by the agent to the Governor-General, and it still flourished on paper. He hoped to start it again before its absence was remarked and to collect its scholars before they produced children of their own. Fielding laughed at the tangle and waste of energy, but he did not travel as lightly as in the past. Education was a continuous concern to him, because his income and the comfort of his family depended on it. He knew that few Indians think education good in itself, and he deplored this now on the widest grounds. He began to say something heavy on the subject of native states, but the friendliness of Aziz distracted him. This reconciliation was a success. Anyhow, after the funny shipwreck there had been no more nonsense or bitterness, and they went back laughingly to their old relationship as if nothing had happened. Now they rode between jolly bushes and rocks. Presently the ground opened into full sunlight and they saw a grassy slope bright with butterflies, also a cobra, which crawled across doing nothing in particular, and disappeared among some custard apple trees. There were round white clouds in the sky, and white pools on the earth. The hills in the distance were purple. The scene was as park-like as England, but did not cease being queer. They drew rein, to give the cobra elbow room, and Aziz produced a letter that he wanted to send to Miss Quested. A charming letter. He wanted to thank his old enemy for her fine behavior 2 years back. Perfectly plain was it now that she had behaved well. As I fell into our largest tank under circumstances our other friends will relate, I thought how brave Miss Quested was, and decided to tell her so. Despite my imperfect English, through you I am happy here with my children instead of in a prison. Of that I make no doubt. My children shall be taught to speak of you with the greatest affection and respect. Miss Quested will be greatly pleased. I am glad you have seen her courage at last. I want to do kind actions all round and wipe out the wretched business of the Malabar forever. I have been so disgracefully hasty, thinking you meant to get hold of my money, as bad a mistake as the cave itself. Aziz, I wish you would talk to my wife. She too believes that the Malabar is wiped out. How so? I don't know. Perhaps she might tell you. She won't tell me. She has ideas I don't share. Indeed, when I'm away from her I think them ridiculous. When I'm with her, I suppose because I'm fond of her, I feel different. I feel half dead and half blind. My wife's after something. You and I and Miss Quested are, roughly speaking, not after anything. We jog on as decently as we can, you a little in front. A laudable little party. But my wife is not with us. What are you meaning? Is Stella not faithful to you, Cyril? This fills me with great concern. Fielding hesitated. He was not quite happy about his marriage. He was passionate physically again, the final flare-up before the clinkers of middle age, and he knew that his wife did not love him as much as he loved her, and he was ashamed of pestering her. But during the visit to Moore the situation had improved. There seemed a link between them at last, that link outside either participant that is necessary to every relationship. In the language of theology, their union had been blessed. He could assure Aziz that Stella was not only faithful to him, but likely to become more so. And trying to express what was not clear to himself, he added dully that different people had different points of view. If you won't talk about the Malabar to Stella, why won't you talk to Ralph? He is a wise boy really. And, same metaphor, he rides a little behind her, though with her. Tell him also, I have nothing to say to him. But he is indeed a wise boy and has always one Indian friend. I partly love him because he brought me back to you to say goodbye, for this is goodbye, Cyril, though to think about it will spoil our ride and make us sad. No, we won't think about it. He too felt that this was their last free intercourse. All the stupid misunderstandings had been cleared up. But socially they had no meeting place. He had thrown in his lot with Anglo-India by marrying a countrywoman, and he was acquiring some of its limitations, and already felt surprise at his own past heroism. Would he today defy all his own people for the sake of a stray Indian? Aziz was a memento, a trophy, They were proud of each other, yet they must inevitably part. And, anxious to make what he could of this last afternoon, he forced himself to speak intimately about his wife, the person most dear to him. He said, from her point of view, Moore has been a success. It calmed her. Both of them suffer from restlessness. She found something soothing, some solution of her queer troubles here. After a silence, myriads of kisses around them as the earth drew the water in, he continued, do you know anything about this Krishna business? My dear chap, officially they call it Gokulashtami. All the state offices are closed, but how else should it concern you and me? Gokul is the village where Krishna was born, well, more or less born, for there's the same hovering between it and another village as between Bethlehem and Nazareth. What I want to discover is its spiritual side, if it has one. It is useless discussing Hindus with me. Living with them teaches me no more. When I think I annoy them, I do not. When I think I don't annoy them, I do. Perhaps they will sack me for tumbling onto their doll's house. On the other hand, perhaps they will double my salary. Time will prove. Why so curious about them? It's difficult to explain. I never really understood or liked them, except an occasional scrap of God bowl. Does the old fellow still say come, come? Oh, presumably. Fielding sighed, opened his lips, shut them, then said with a little laugh, I can't explain, because it isn't in words at all, but why do my wife and her brother like Hinduism, though they take no interest in its forms? They won't talk to me about this. They know I think a certain side of their lives is a mistake, and are shy. That's why I wish you would talk to them, for at all events you're Oriental. Aziz refused to reply. He didn't want to meet Stella and Ralph again, knew they didn't want to meet him, was incurious about their secrets, and felt good old Cyril to be a bit clumsy. Something, not a sight, but a sound, flitted past him, and caused him to reread his letter to Miss Quested. Hadn't he wanted to say something else to her? Taking out his pen, he added, for my own part, I shall henceforth connect you with the name that is very sacred in my mind, namely, Mrs. Moore. When he had finished, the mirror of the scenery was shattered, the meadow disintegrated into butterflies. A poem about Mecca, the Kaaba of Union, the thorn bushes where pilgrims die before they have seen the friend they flitted next. He thought of his wife, and then the whole semi-mystic, semi-sensuous overturn, so characteristic of his spiritual life, came to end like a landslip and rested in its due place, and he found himself riding in the jungle with his dear Cyril. Oh, shut up, he said. Don't spoil our last hour with foolish questions. Leave Krishna alone, and talk about something sensible. They did. All the way back to Moore they wrangled about politics. Each had hardened since Chandrapur, and a good knockabout proved enjoyable. They trusted each other, although they were going to part. Perhaps because they were going to part. Fielding had no further use for politeness, he said, meaning that the British Empire really can't be abolished because it's rude. Aziz retorted, very well, and we have no use for you, and glared at him with abstract hate. Fielding said, away from us, Indians go to seed at once. Look at the King Emperor High School. Look at you, forgetting your medicine and going back to charms. Look at your poems. Jolly good poems, I'm getting published Bombay side. Yes, and what do they say? Free our women and India will be free. Try it, my lad. Free your own lady in the first place, and see who'll wash Ahmed Karim and Jamala's faces. A nice situation. Aziz grew more excited. He rose in his stirrups and pulled at his horse's head in the hope it would rear. Then he should feel in a battle. He cried, "Clear out, all you Turtons and Burtons. We wanted to know you 10 years back. Now it's too late. If we see you and sit on your committees, it's for political reasons. Don't you make any mistake." His horse did rear. "Clear out, I say. Why are we put to so much suffering? We used to blame you, now we blame ourselves. We grow wiser. Until England is in difficulties we keep silent, but in the next European war, then is our time." He paused, and the scenery, though it smiled, fell like a gravestone on any human hope. They cantered past a temple to Han Newman. God so loved the world that he took monkey's flesh upon him, and past a Savite temple, which invited to lust, but under the semblance of eternity, its obscenities bearing no relation to those of our flesh and blood. They splashed through butterflies and frogs. Great trees with leaves like plates rose among the brushwood. The divisions of daily life were returning. The shrine had almost shut. "Who do you want instead of the English? The Japanese?" jeered Fielding, drawing rein. "No, the Afghans. My own ancestors." "Oh, your Hindu friends will like that, won't they? It will be arranged, a conference of Oriental statesmen. It will indeed be arranged. Old story of we will rob every man and rape every woman from Peshawar to Calcutta, I suppose, which you get some nobody to repeat and then quote every week in the Pioneer in order to frighten us into retaining you. We know." Still he couldn't quite fit in Afghans at more, and, finding he was in a corner, made his horse rear again until he remembered that he had, or ought to have, a motherland. Then he shouted, "India shall be a nation. No foreigners of any sort. Hindu and Muslim and Sikh and all shall be one. India a nation." What an apotheosis! Last comer to the drab 19th century sisterhood, waddling in at this hour of the world to take her seat. She, whose only peer was the Holy Roman Empire, she shall rank with Guatemala and Belgium perhaps. Fielding mocked again. And Aziz in an awful rage danced this way and that, not knowing what to do, and cried, "Down with the English anyhow." "That's certain. Clear out, you fellows, double quick, I say. We may hate one another, but we hate you most. If I don't make you go, Ahmed will. Kareem will. If it's 5,500 years we shall get rid of you. Yes, we shall drive every blasted Englishman into the sea." And then he rode against him furiously, and then, he concluded, half kissing him, "You and I shall be friends." "Why can't we be friends now?" said the other, holding him affectionately. "It's what I want." "It's what you want." But the horses didn't want it. They swerved apart. The earth didn't want it, sending up rocks through which riders must pass single file. The temples, the tank, the jail, the palace, the birds, the carrion, the guest house, that came into view as they issued from the gap and saw more beneath. They didn't want it. They said in their 100 voices, "No, not yet." And the sky said, "No, not there."